What if an alien landed in your backyard and told you Earth was about to split into two realities, and that you would have only a small window of time to choose which one you'd live in? Imagine the certainty in that voice, not shouted but pressed into your mind like a key sliding into a lock. Imagine waking at 3:14 a.m., the clock's tiny red numbers a metronome for a life that suddenly feels disassembled, and hearing an answer to a question you barely knew you were asking. Thomas Walsh had asked the question in the dark without knowing it. He had built his life like a careful machine, a corner office, an executive title that fit like a heavy coat, investments that kept compounding, vacations that were meticulously scheduled and enjoyed in short, efficient bursts. Awards lined a closet shelf he rarely opened. His calendar was always full, his hands were always busy. But at 3:14 a.m., when the house was a soft, breathing hush and the refrigerator hummed 2 rooms away, the coat slid off, and under it he discovered a nakedness he could not dress. He lay awake and listened to the silence, counting not minutes but the empty spaces where meaning used to be. He woke Linda sometimes with a touch to her shoulder. Sometimes he sat on the kitchen stool until the dawn light rolled him back to sleep. In the living room there was a stack of books with bookmarks like flags of failed missions. Mindfulness, ancient myths, near-death accounts, a battered copy of a physics essay that never quite made sense. There was a photograph of his grandson, a 6-year-old with a gap-toothed grin and a mop of hair that never obeyed a comb. That boy smiled as if the world were an answer he had already found. He didn't carry Thomas's ledger of disappointments. He was, Thomas thought in a moment of private and sudden tenderness, a small compass needle pointing somewhere Thomas had forgotten how to look. This was the ache that drew him out into the backyard one night when the insomnia was sharp and dry as old paper. He told himself he would breathe under the stars for 10 minutes and be back inside before Linda stirred. The Arizona sky was a clean sheet of black velvet, freckled with so many stars they seemed excessive. The air smelled faintly of creosote and the cold thumbprint of desert night. The pool reflected the sky in a glass pane that quivered when a lizard scuttled past on the limestone. He set his coffee mug down, more habit than necessity, and felt his heart beat against the ribs like somebody knocking insistently at a door. At first he thought it was a helicopter, a distant, steady thrum that rose and fell. But the sound didn't come from above. It seemed to come from the ground beneath his feet, a bass note tuned to the bones. The pool glass skivered, then a column of blue-silver light spilled across the concrete and the night condensed into a single bright point. There was no fan wash, no vibration of rotors, only a sense that the air had rearranged itself around something liquid and impossible. A craft like molten glass, its surface moving as if waves were passing under skin. It was silent enough to erase the refrigerator hum. Thomas felt fear and a calmness so close they were indistinguishable. He had the absurd thought that his body was an old radio and someone had simply changed the station. The being that stepped from the light was not the spindly, dramatic shape of science fiction. It was tall in a way that made the porch light look childish. Limbs not rigid but flowing like silk threads caught in a breeze. Its skin, if skin is the word to use, shimmered in scale-like flashes of blue and silver. There were no visible eyes, only planes that suggested sight in a way that made Thomas aware of his own blink. When it spoke, it did not open a mouth. The thought arrived whole, immediate, and clean inside Thomas's mind, like someone switching on a lamp in a room he had been fumbling in. The voice was neither male nor female, yet it carried warmth. "Thomas Walsh," the being said, "you came out to listen." He could have run. He could have called for Linda, for the police. He did not. The thing about being 40 years into the same orbit of questions is that fear sometimes looks exactly like curiosity. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his robe and watched the being as if watching a friend perform a simple ritual. There was a tremor in his chest, a heat that slid under his skin and settled around his throat. Sweat beaded on his lip. "You are tired," the voice continued, not accusing, but cataloging like an archivist. "You have accumulated surfaces. Under them, a hollow." That simple naming of emptiness made Thomas taste salt. He thought of the pile of books, of the empty chair at dinners where discussions used to be about strategy and margin. He thought of his grandson's laugh and how it crawled back like a rope he could reach for. "Who are you?" he managed aloud, feeling foolish for using a word that implied he could understand or name what he faced. "We are a visitation," it said, and the words came like a map folded open across his mind. Not masters, not owners, observers and messengers. We have come to show, to offer choice. The being's telepathic sentences were short, precise, and gentle. They had no attempt at theatrics. That steadiness settled Thomas's nerves in a way a stranger's voice could not. It also made what followed more terrible in its clarity. The being did not berate. It did not threaten. It asked him to look. Then it laid out an image in his head that belonged more to cosmic architecture. A slow, invisible wobble. A planetary breath made visible. The being described the precession cycle, not as a textbook fact, but as a living rhythm, a 26,000-year swing that threaded political rises and falls, the patterns of myth, the births and endings of eras. In the vision, Earth was a living eye turning toward a particular starfield, a slow tuning into a station that produced a different kind of reception. The being used a metaphor Thomas could grasp. Frequencies on a radio, stations layered one over another. When you drift, static. When you finely tune, clarity. In your human measurement, the being said, this cycle completes near a 26,000-year pattern. In your recent time, you have been approaching a shift. In your human counting, the movement began to hasten around what you call 2012. We are now in the passage. The change requires choice. Thomas sank onto the poolside chair as if gravity had learned to negotiate new terms. He tried to make sense of the numbers, of the ancient rhythms described in terms that sounded like myth. The being's words did not ask him to believe in a catalog of doctrines. They asked him to witness a demonstration, to accept that some processes had become, in the being's terms, urgent. "Urgent?" Thomas whispered. He felt the word like a current. "Not urgency as panic," the being replied. "Urgency as narrowing of doors. The field divides when the tuning becomes incompatible. Where there is disharmony, density thickens. Where there is coherent heart-led resonance, a different weave opens." It was then that the being produced the image that would split Thomas's interior before it split any sky. A vision of Earth folded in two like a double-exposed photograph. One side was familiar. Streets lit by electric signs. Faces bathed in neon. Heads bent toward glowing rectangles. The air between people taut with mistrust. The other side was luminous, not with electric light, but with the kind of clarity that made color feel like language. People moved with a fluid lack of hurry, hands landing on one another like anchors. It was not an image of utopia, but of different priorities. Connection over extraction. Conversation over consumption. Depth over spectacle. "In the way you will perceive it," the being said, "your species will see increasing polarization. Systems will strain. Minds will narrow into old patterns or begin to widen. Both will occupy the same physical coordinates. The separation is not of place. It is of attention. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He saw Linda's face in the clip of Street Life. The way she frowned at late-night news. The way she folded blankets and worried quietly. He saw his grandson chasing a dog through a sun-washed yard, and the child laughed as if he were already on the other side. What the being painted felt like a clinical report dispatched with compassion and the simplest of warnings. Attention chooses destiny. The being's voice shifted, taking on a quality that threaded quiet amusement with implacable gravity. He felt suddenly like a man perched on a cliff with a warning in his mouth and a crowd below who would not step back. The being, without malice, answered, "You will have your life. You will have decisions. You will also have influence. The personal and the collective are not separate. The many small workings in a human life compound. Witnessing without proselytizing may affect your immediate circle. Abandonment of fear is an action. Small choices ripple." It mentioned once with an almost clinical softness that this visitation was one testimony among many. Not universal proof, the being said, as if anticipating the need for humility in a world hungry for certainty. A demonstration, an offer. At that moment, the being pressed an image that was not a map, but the anatomy of habit itself. It showed Thomas a close-up of everyday decisions, a pause before speaking that prevented an argument from inflating, a gesture of anonymous kindness that altered an invisible ledger of goodwill, a morning ritual of gratitude that shifted perception from scarcity to sufficiency. These were not promised guarantees of passage into some enlightened state. The being was careful to frame them as increases in resonance, small steerings of attention that tend toward coherence. In the science you know as practice, it said, these shifts are accumulative. They are not miraculous erasers of consequence. They are inclinations. They tend the field. Thomas wanted proof. He wanted a certificate stamped and signed. Instead, the being offered him memories. The memory of his grandson's soft hand in his. The memory of laughter shared at a kitchen table where nothing was at stake. The memory of Linda's face when she had once forgiven him a small cruelty. The being's telepathic touch on his recollection did not feel intrusive. It felt like a midwife reminding him how he had been born into tenderness and habitually mislaid it. Then the being did something Thomas did not expect. It asked him to witness his own body as part of an energy system. It described emotions not as storms to be suppressed, but as weather to be observed. Watch the anger as you would watch a wave, it instructed. See the size. See where it breaks. Do not let it define shorelines. Thomas heard the instructions and felt simultaneously ridiculous and profoundly relieved. He had been trained in metrics and profit margins, not in watching anger without ammunition. Yet witnessing required nothing except attention. He tried it then, under the blue light, and observed the rise of indignation at being visited, judged, or disregarded. He noticed the sensation and named it silently. The wave did not immediately leave. It shrank a fraction. The being's presence had introduced a variable he had never considered, attention as a technological tool. Small acts repeated become a different habit of being, the being said. You will not be perfect. The aim is not perfection. The aim is repetition. Frequency is not a stage, it is a pattern. Thomas thought of morning coffee sipped hurriedly, of the times he had spoken without listening, of days he had permitted the urgent to eclipse the important. The being's words felt both like an indictment and a gift. He wanted to cling to them, to memorize the cadence of each clause so he could repeat it as prayer. He felt a childish hope. Perhaps if he simply cataloged these instructions, he could recoup what he had lost. There was a pause in the telepathic conversation, a quiet that was not silence but a buffering of meaning. The craft's blue-silver light breathed, and for a moment the world was as if viewed through a lens that softened edges and sharpened essential lines. The being then placed before him an image of the two Earths again, but closer, more detailed. On one side, the faces were anxious, lined with suspicion, posture constricted. On the other, the faces were varied but open, hands meeting hands, commerce smaller as human presence became larger. You will be given opportunities to practice, the being said. Not as test or punishment, but as education. The world will present friction. Where you respond from reflex, density tends to increase. Where you respond from measured heart, coherence tends to increase. Thomas swallowed. The words were not promises of salvation. The being did not give the kind of absolute guarantees that make slogans and bumper stickers. But the message was ethically weighty. It suggested personal responsibility without blaming victims. It suggested that solutions lay in the micro as much as in the macro. At this point, he should have asked, "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Instead, he asked something smaller and personal, because the child in him needed grounding. What about my Linda? What about my grandson? What about the life I have built? The being's response came not in abstract, but in imagery. A scene of Thomas sitting at a table with Linda the next evening. A conversation that tasted awkward at first, then softens as he pauses before answering, as he listens past the desire to correct. A version of himself that shows up, not as a savior with cosmic secrets, but as a man who has learned to stop and be present when his grandson shows him how to sing to plants. The being did not promise transformative miracles overnight. The scene was deliberately modest and therefore, in its own way, radical. Presence is a kind of currency, the being said. Spend it. These were intimate instructions, almost banal in their simplicity. Notice breath, pause before responding, put an ear to the small things. But Thomas felt inside him a subterranean hope that such smallness might aggregate into radicalness. The being's descriptions had the moral taste of a program that refused to be either sensationalist or flippant. It invited steadiness. Then, and this was what brought a new gravity into the conversation, the being made a statement that clipped the air like a blade. There will be a narrowing in which the contrast becomes sharper. You will not all be asked to move spatially. You will be asked to move attentively. Thomas's knees went weak and he sat back. He felt suddenly very old and also very childlike, as if someone had given him a homework assignment that was also his salvation. He imagined futures folding and unfolding like a map of roads he had never taken. Some lanes of his life leading to rooms where warmth and connection had been cultivated. Others leading to corridors lined with glass and buzzing electronics. "How much time?" he asked, the practical query that old professionals like him defaulted to, as if deadlines alone clothed the world in meaning. The being repeated the dates with the same measured tone. Your outer calendars mark intensification toward 2025. Between 2025 and 2033, the contrast increases. After 2033, the delineation is more pronounced. The numbers landed in him like pebbles thrown into water. They rippled outward and touched all the small, unspoken anxieties Thomas had managed to keep in a locked drawer. He thought of friends with mortgages and of his grandson's children. One could not help but count the years and feel the net of responsibility. Before he could gather all the implications, the being shifted the conversation in a way that felt personal and practical. "Begin with gratitude," it said, with the economy of someone reciting a prescription that had been tested on myriad subjects. 5 minutes. List 3 things. Do not rush the list as a performance. Taste each item like a seed. "Gratitude?" Thomas echoed, half embarrassed, half electrified by the simplicity. "Gratitude is a tuning practice," the being replied. "It adjusts the field. It is not magic that erases hardship. It is a lever that rebalances attention. The telepathic voice was steady, as if the being had practiced explaining spiritual mechanics to many species with different frontal lobes and different languages. It named another practice without fanfare: the pause before speaking. Let the space decide the word. Allow the heart to edit the tongue. Then it showed him a practice of witnessing, simply noticing the rise of emotions without handing them a script. Then a connection to nature, daily exposure, even small, to living systems. Anonymous service, self-forgiveness, purposeful action. Each recommendation landed with the gentle authority of someone who had not arrived to fix the world, but to show a path of small, repeatable choices. Thomas could feel his mind cataloging them, making lists again, the old habit of trying to make meaning into a schedule. He resisted the urge to make a to-do from a visitation. The being's presence, however, made that impulse less complicit and more resourceful. But the being also emphasized limits. Practices increase likelihood. They do not guarantee outcomes. Not all who practice will shift in the same way. Not all will choose in the same time. This is not dogma. It is a map of tendencies. That caution was a salve, because Thomas could imagine the conversation being weaponized into a slogan, used to exclude or to promise false certainties. He appreciated the being's humility because it gave him the space to choose without coercion. "How will I know my choices are working?" he asked, the procedural mind still hunting for signs on the horizon. The being responded with a small miracle of a picture: the slow loosening of a jaw, softening eyes, an argument that dissipates at a pause rather than exploding, a child's belly laugh that is not interrupted by a phone. "You will notice clarity," it said. "You will notice presence. You will notice the compounding of small acts into an inclination." For a moment, Thomas almost laughed. Those were intangible metrics. They could not be measured by spreadsheets, but they felt truer than any quarterly report. There was one more image the being pressed into him before the encounter deepened. The child again, his grandson's hand gripping his finger, and in the child's face a look of unlit expectation, as if the boy trusted that adults would remember how to love without scoreboard. The sight pried open something in Thomas that had been welded closed with practicalities and fear. He felt the crude architecture of his identity tremble, and behind it a path he might not have had the courage to choose without this visitation. The being's next words were soft but loaded. "People will call this many things. You will be tempted to translate into categories that suit your tribe. We offer a view and an invitation. It is up to each to test, practice, and decide." Thomas wanted to test. He wanted to write down the exercises and practice them, not as a panacea, but as a series of experiments. He wanted to be an empirical subject in a spiritual laboratory. Yet the being also told him that some things could not be measured by immediate results. Some shifts were slow and required patience. As you go, it said, watch for the signs of anxiety that are clinical. If your suffering is heavy in the way that medicine and therapy attend to, accept help. Do not mistake spiritual language for a substitute for professional care. That sentence relieved him more than he expected. It had the weight of someone who had seen devotion weaponized against people in pain. The being's insistence that suffering sometimes needs clinical intervention felt like a rare and careful kindness. Thomas felt the night settled differently on him after that. The being did not stay forever. It offered him more: glimpses of possible futures, the mechanics of resonance, sketches of practices, but it gave him no miraculous out. It did not promise a door would open and life would rearrange itself. The being's next words were soft but loaded. People will call this many things. You will be tempted to translate into categories that suit your tribe. We offer a view and an invitation. It is up to each to test, practice, and decide.
Thomas wanted to test. He wanted to write down the exercises and practice them, not as a panacea, but as a series of experiments. He wanted to be an empirical subject in a spiritual laboratory. Yet the being also told him that some things could not be measured by immediate results. Some shifts were slow and required patience. As you go, it said, watch for the signs of anxiety that are clinical. If your suffering is heavy in the way that medicine and therapy attend to, accept help. Do not mistake spiritual language for a substitute for professional care. That sentence relieved him more than he expected. It had the weight of someone who had seen devotion weaponized against people in pain. The being's insistence that suffering sometimes needs clinical intervention felt like a rare and careful kindness. Thomas felt the night settled differently on him after that. The being did not stay forever. It offered him more: glimpses of possible futures, the mechanics of resonance, sketches of practices. But it gave him no miraculous out. It did not promise a door would open and life would rearrange itself.
It promised only that small acts repeated changed the odds. When the light began to pull back, not abruptly but with the slow retraction of a tide, Thomas felt an odd sense of grief, as if someone had just read him a long, honest letter and now needed to leave. He wanted to ask more questions. What about the institutions? What about governments? What about the people who would seek to manipulate the narrowing for their own gain? But those were big theatrical questions he felt suddenly reluctant to burden this being with. The being had been practical, almost austere in its teaching. Its preference was to give tools rather than battle plans. Remember, it said, as the blue-silver light thinned, the greatest influence is small fidelity. Presence, gratitude, pause, witness, nature, service, forgiveness, purpose. 7 words, if he counted them, and each felt like a pebble he could carry in his pocket to remind him of a way to act. He tried to memorize them in the low, thin light, and for a moment each felt like a small vow. The craft rose with a sound like the closing of a shell. The desert air resumed its ordinary humming. The stars became stars again. Thomas sat for a long time on the poolside chair, his robe small against the night, his hands folded over his knees, as if to keep the contours of the evening from evaporating. He had not been given a guarantee, only a model and a set of practices. He had not been asked to sell his house or to join a sect. He had been asked to alter the moment-to-moment architecture of his attention. When he finally walked back inside, the living room looked the same. The stack of books, the child's drawings taped to the fridge, the rug worn at the entry. But something had shifted in how he saw them. The pile of unread books now looked like a potential, not a monument to failure. Linda slept with a hand half under her cheek and seemed content in a way that was more ordinary than he remembered. He did not wake her. He made a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and he noticed the smell more than he had ever done before. That night was the beginning of a labor that had no clear blueprint. The being's revelations had an urgent clarity tempered with an ethical humility. Thomas had been offered a map drawn in the language of attention and habit. He had also been given a timeline that made the map feel immediate. As dawn touched the mountains, he sat at the kitchen table and opened one of the books he had never finished. He read about ancient cycles, about mythic acts that mirrored human needs to narrativize change. He penned a single sentence in the margin: "Begin with 5 minutes." He underlined it twice. And yet, even as he tried to move from the grandeur of vision into the smallness of practice, there came a new, creeping doubt he could not name. The being had spoken of times and choices and compounding small acts, but it had also suggested that some things outside individual practice might complicate the path: social friction, political strain, systems that had never been designed for the kind of attentional shift being described. Thomas could not forget how many of his friends seemed anchored by fear and habit. He thought of corporations and systems built to harvest attention, and he wondered, if two realities could overlay the same physical space, how would the daily mechanics of groceries and banks and hospitals respond? Who would steward the thinness of life if people didn't notice? He forced himself not to spin into conspiracy. The being had cautioned against melodrama. It had offered practices, not manifestos. Still, the story lodged, a narrowing, a choice, a window, a timeline that moved like a tide against the shore of his life. He had to make a choice, even if at first the choice was only to try the smallest of things: 5 minutes of gratitude the next morning, a pause before speaking that afternoon, a walk outside to touch a living tree. He wrote the list in a neat column, each item modest and actionable, as if the very act of listing could help it become real. He did not tell Linda that morning. He did not know how to begin. He simply made the small moves the being had suggested and watched the day not transform but adjust. By evening, when his grandson bounded through the door with a story about a dinosaur that had been kind to a plant, Thomas found himself listening without the wish to fix the tale's moral. He let the child unfold his small cosmos and felt, like a quiet bell, something within him retune. The encounter had given him an invitation and a calendar. It had not given him immunity. It had not promised that he would be spared pain or confusion. It had given instead a method for tending the small inner weather of his life. That was the thrust of the message, and it sat with him like an ember, small, steady, potentially able to start a fire if tended. But even as he began to practice, he felt the sensation of a horizon closing, dates and windows, and the sense of a narrowing, not meant as doom, but as a clarifying lens. He felt also the weight of responsibility to make choices that were aligned not only with his private well-being, but with the kind of world he wanted to help shape for the child at his knee. He would have to tell someone. He would have to test these practices in the world of bills and urgent emails and enemy headlines. He would have to hold tenderness when systems frayed and remember the being's caution that some suffering needed clinical care and could not be spiritualized away. He would have to navigate the curious pressure that comes when an experience refuses to be contained by polite skepticism. Night after night he practiced, each exercise a pebble thrown into the pool of his attention. Sometimes the ripples felt immediate, a softened conversation, a child's laugh extended into a longer note. Sometimes there was no visible change. Once he snapped at Linda over something small and felt the shame of old reflexes. He sat afterward and practiced the being's instruction to witness without self-condemnation, to notice the anger, feel its heat, and then let it pass without building a palace of justification around it. It did not make him perfect. It allowed him to be human. And always there was the image the being had shown him. Two overlapping realities, the path between them marked not by fences, but by the accumulation of attention. He kept that image like a photograph burned into his peripheral vision, and when he looked at the calendar, he could not help but see dates as measured doors. The hours became smaller in a different way. They were not less, but more charged. He found himself asking questions in the quiet. Who else had seen this? What of the millions who carried starvation, not of the stomach, but of meaning? How would systems built to harvest attention adapt when attention itself changed? He tried to keep his curiosity humble and practical. The being had insisted that transformations were not about fleeing institutions, but about shifting how one moved within them. One evening, a week after the visitation, Thomas took his grandson to the small municipal garden by the elementary school. The boy knelt in the dirt and began to sing under his breath to a scrubby plant. A woman with tired eyes was bent over a bench, phone face down at her feet. A dog loped by, tail waving like a flag. Thomas felt the being's teachings as a sheath inside him. He practiced gratitude in a whisper. 3 things, 1 breath each. He paused before answering the boy's insistent questions. He let the silence between words become a room. It was not a dramatic change, but afterward, as he walked home, there was a deepening that felt like the root growth of a plant,
unseen yet steady. He had not negotiated the wider world. He had not solved systemic fractures. He had only begun a private apprenticeship in attention. That apprenticeship, however, might ripple in ways he could not yet foresee. Then, weeks later, when one of his old colleagues called to ask him about an investment opportunity that smelled of the same old models of extraction, Thomas noticed for the first time an instinctive recoil. He paused before agreeing. He felt the being's compact teaching, pause before speaking, work like a hinge. He asked questions that shifted the conversation toward ethical impact, toward service. The colleagues sounded surprised. The deal was not monumental, but the conversation changed the terms of their exchange. The smallness of the act made Thomas feel like a man who had finally found a lever long buried under his own habits. Yet the world beyond his backyard still moved with the empire of habit.
News feeds bled into his day, announcing crises and rallies, compromises and betrayals. Systems seemed, by default, tuned to amplification of fear. He could not ignore that. The being had warned that social fragmentation would intensify and that institutions not designed for heart-centered attention might strain. He had no blueprint for large-scale repair. He only had small practices and the seed of a conviction that those practices could have compound effects. Late one night, months after the encounter, Thomas woke at 3:14 again. The clock's red numbers glared like a question. He felt the same hollow at his ribs, but less cavernous now, more like a place waiting for furniture. He took a breath and began. 5 minutes, 3 gratitudes, a walk to the window where the sky was a slow, patient black. He noticed the feeling of being charged with both urgency and hope, the paradox mixing like two pigments on a painter's palette. He understood, in a way that had less to do with the being and more to do with his own small experiments, that nothing cosmic would be solved by a single revelation. The being had not promised clarity as a gift, but as a discipline. Show up, pay attention, let the small acts accumulate. That was both humbling and terrifying. Just as he was about to rise from the chair, his phone buzzed with a news alert. A new piece of legislation debated in distant capital that touched on surveillance and data rights. He read the headlines and felt again the friction between the intimate practices he had taken up and the gargantuan machinery that could absorb or repel them. The being's words about systems rang in his ear. How institutions might respond when attention shifts. How the same narrowing that clarified could also be exploited. He closed the phone and placed it face down on the table like a coin taken from a slot machine. Outside, the desert night held its ordinary constellation of stars. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and the paper of unread books. He felt both more fragile and more resolute. If the window the being had mentioned truly existed, if 2025 to 2033 were indeed a passage where patterns tightened, then he had the choice to begin now. He got up and went to the bedroom where Linda slept. He lay beside her and felt the familiar contour of her body. He did not wake her. He did not speak cosmic truths into the dark. He let the presence be practice enough. Somewhere far beyond the scrubby hills of Arizona, rooms he could not yet see were filling with people conducting their private experiments in attention. Some of those experiments would be clumsy and driven by fear. Others would bloom into steady fruit. The being's visitation was one testimony, a filament of light dragged through a human life that might or might not become a conduit. Thomas could not know how his small acts would land in the world. He could only keep practicing. He could only hold the dates as a horizon, not as doom, but as a reminder that attention, once set toward the heart, could alter the trajectory of ordinary days. And then, a month after the visitation, on a humid evening when the sky looked as if someone had smeared a gray wash over it, Thomas received an unexpected invitation. An email from a woman he recognized only by name. A curious academic who had written about cultural transitions and collective attention. She wanted to meet. She had heard of an encounter and asked if he might speak. The message was careful, not sensational. A researcher, not a tabloid.
Thomas read the note twice. He felt a pull between the wish to remain private and the sense that testimony, like seed, needs soil. He thought of the being's caution, witness without proselytizing. He thought of the being's insistence that small acts ripple. He thought of his grandson's hand in his own. He felt both fear and an odd readiness. The email's punctuation felt like an opening. He drafted a reply and then sat with it for an hour before sending. He wrote in measured sentences, honoring the being's instruction to be clear without theatrics. He did not mention dates in social media posts. He did not broadcast the vision. He kept the balance between private practice and public testimony, as if the human world required both humility and courage. When he hit send, the house felt suddenly larger and emptier at once. He was walking a path without a map, carrying a pebble of practices in his pocket and a calendar with marked doors he did not know how to open. The night held its own indifference and its own mercy. The ember that the visitation had left in him glowed. He could not know if it would grow into fire or smolder out in ash. But beneath the surface of novelty, beneath the numbers and the images of two overlapping earths, there was another question that the being had not exactly answered, and that made Thomas's breath catch whenever he thought of it. How to live, day by day, in a world that might already be choosing for him, and how to do so without falling into the twin traps, paralysis born of fear, and the other, quieter trap, spiritual certainty that becomes its own kind of blindness. He felt both tug at him like competing hands. If he surrendered to fear, he would build walls and watch the world through binoculars of suspicion. If he surrendered to certainty, he might mistake a practice for proof and shut the door on honest doubt. The being had not given him a roadmap that erased tension. It had given him practices that required humility. That, perhaps, was the real test. Days moved into months with a strange elasticity. Some mornings he found the old hollowness returning, teeth clicking like loose gears. Other mornings were small vectors, an unhurried breakfast with Linda, a genuine question asked of his grandson that invited a story, a meeting where he listened more than he spoke and felt the conversation shift. The practices the being had suggested began to accumulate like savings deposits. Gratitude became not a performance, but a habit of noticing. The pause before answering was a hinge that opened different doors. Witnessing emotions became a way to stop wasting energy on reactions that always left him poorer. He met with the academic Dr. Mara Ellison in a sunlit atrium at the university. She wore sensible shoes and a curious, cautious face. Their conversation was careful, the tone of two adults weighing the possibility that extraordinary testimony might nonetheless be of value as data about human response. She asked about his sleep patterns, about his diet, about whether he had used substances. She asked, gently, whether he had considered the possibility of a sleep paralysis episode, a hypnagogic hallucination. He answered truthfully. He told her about the poolside light, the calm that was almost a kindness, the instructions that were concrete and helpful. She listened and said things a scientist says when she wants to keep a door open without asserting more than the evidence supported. I work with cultural transitions, she told him. Testimony is a kind of data. How individuals integrate an event matters. If your practices lead to more presence and less harm in your life, that is meaningful regardless of the ontological origin of the experience. She proposed a small, informal study, a short series of interviews and self-reports, a place to measure psychological well-being alongside qualitative accounts of practice. Thomas agreed, not because he wanted to prove the being right, but because he wanted to learn whether his changes were idiosyncratic or part of a pattern. The idea of being part of a humble study made him feel less alone and less exposed. It gave him a way to translate private practice into social knowledge. As the research took shape, Thomas began to connect with a handful of neighbors in subtle ways. He did not announce his visitation on social media. He did not stage a public spectacle. Instead, he invited a few people, Linda, an old friend who liked community gardening, a retired teacher who practiced yoga, to meet for coffee and discuss small experiments in attention. He framed it as a curiosity group. He framed it in plain language that resisted mythic grandiosity. The group met in the municipal garden on Saturday mornings. They would practice gratitude out loud, tend a plot of basil, and report small changes. The meetings had no formal agenda, only a slow, missionless fidelity. The gatherings multiplied their own gravity. People who felt lonely found company without being proselytized. Arguments that would have once erupted over politics were interrupted by a practiced pause. Someone would notice their own rising voice and take a breath. Sometimes the changes were barely visible. A softer tone, a helping hand.
Other times, a neighbor showed up with a breakdown, a real clinical crisis, and the group, guided by the being's counsel, insisted on professional help. They called a crisis line, arranged transport, and bore witness without attempting to spiritualize what needed medical attention. That insistence on both spiritual practice and clinical care became a quiet, ethical boundary the group honored. News of Thomas's private experiments did leak, not as sensational headline, but as small threads of curiosity. The academic published a careful, non-sensational paper about attention practices in a community pilot, written in sober language and with methodological caution. The paper did not assert metaphysical claims. It reported changes in self-reported presence, declines in reactive conflict in interpersonal interactions, and an increase in volunteer activity in the neighborhood. Readers who wanted definitive proof of cosmic intervention would not find it. Readers who were looking for practices that actually changed how they lived might find something useful. Even with slow progress, the calendar dates the being had given him kept returning to the forefront. 2025 and the years between then and 2033 were no longer abstract markers. They were doors he could see on a long road. He felt urgency in a new register, not panic, but taste. The flavor of a life that needed tending sooner rather than later. He wanted to speak publicly in measured terms, yet he feared unintentionally incentivizing fear in others. He remembered the being's caution against proselytizing. So he rehearsed an approach. Say what he had seen, emphasize the practices, hold space for skepticism, and insist on the limits of testimony. In the spring of 2025, he did speak to a small public forum hosted by the university, framed as a personal account within a panel on cultural responses to global change. He spoke plainly. The backyard night, the being's instruction, the practices, the dates. He emphasized that this was one person's vision and that the practices were what anyone could test. He spoke about his fear of the twin traps and how his antidote was the daily discipline of small acts. The audience was mixed. Curious faces, skeptical ones, journalists, students. He did not offer proof. He offered what he had, his own changes, his regrets, his experiments. After the panel, a woman approached him in the corridor with tears in her eyes. She said she had read the paper and had been practicing gratitude for 3 weeks. She told him that the practice had not erased her grief at losing a partner, but it had given her mornings back. She asked if she could join their garden meetings. Thomas felt a strange thing then, that testimony could be neither mere spectacle nor pure solipsism. It could be a bridge. The woman's gratitude was not proof of cosmic mechanics, but it was evidence of human effect. That was enough, for now, to keep him moving. The world, of course, did not wait on personal transformations. Systems strained. The headlines rolled, economic crises in far-off places, a scandal over data privacy, a political confrontation that gnawed public trust. The being's vision of polarizing tendencies did not manifest overnight in neat forms. It appeared as 1,000 small tensions that knotted social life, comment threads that hardened into identity lines, institutions that struggled to adapt to attention-shifted consumers, companies that doubled down on extraction, and those that experimented with heart-centered governance. Thomas watched these things with the same eyes he used to watch quarterly reports. Alert,
curious and increasingly inclined to test not only what could be done to systems at scale, but what small behaviors could render systems less harmful in their effects. Alongside these macro narratives, there were intimate, messy human moments. One afternoon, in the kitchen, Linda and Thomas argued over money in a way that used to escalate. In the past, he would have defended a point, calmed himself into a rational spreadsheet, and expected vindication. This time he breathed, noticed the rising heat, and used the pause the being had taught him. He listened. He did not solve the problem with a clever plan. Instead, he offered a small apology for past dismissals. Linda softened. The argument did not disappear. It changed shape. They did not become saintly. They simply practiced a kind of civilized repair. The neighbor's garden continued to yield basil and small, ordinary rituals that felt surprisingly sacred. Thomas also wrestled with failure. There were days he forgot gratitude, days he lashed out and felt the old reflex right away. Those days were hard. He had to resist the story that practice only counts when it is perfect. The being had warned explicitly about perfectionism. Frequency is a pattern, not a pedestal. Thomas learned to speak to himself with the same gentleness he now practiced with others. Notice, forgive, and choose again. Sometimes he would lie awake at 3:14, not in the grip of despair, but in a more manageable melancholy, and he would repeat the simple list: presence, gratitude, pause, witness, nature, service, forgiveness, purpose. Each was like a pebble in his pocket, not a talisman, but a tool. The being's timeline, meanwhile, folded into public imagination in small ways. Some groups adopted the language of raising frequency as a metaphor for civic engagement and environmental stewardship. Others turned the concept into a slogan to sell products that promised quick fixes. Thomas felt the sting of commodification and the relief of humility in equal measure. The being's instructions resisted being packaged. They required time, attention, and ethical restraint. Thomas watched, worried sometimes, as people chased the spectacle of ascension as if it were another commodity. He offered gentle corrections when asked. Practices are not a product.
They are disciplines. The academic study he participated in gathered a modest data set. It showed increased reported well-being among participants who committed to daily practices for 90 days, alongside qualitative themes: increased patience, more deliberate speech, and a rise in anonymous service. The paper carried the predictable caveats: small sample size, self-selection bias, and the need for larger trials. The findings did not prove cosmic mechanics. They did suggest that attention practices changed behavior, which was precisely what the being had taught. The results circulated in the small worlds that read such studies and sparked debate about scale and scalability. Some scholars suggested policy experiments to incorporate attention practices into schools and workplaces as a public health intervention. Others warned against turning spiritual disciplines into bureaucratic mandates. The debate itself was instructive. It revealed that any large-scale shift would need humility, intentionality, and ethical guardrails. As 2027 approached, Thomas felt the calendar like an instrument that tuned him. He watched trends. Polarization in some regions deepened, while in other pockets people practiced new economies of attention and care. The being's words that the split would not necessarily be spatial but attentional proved curiously apt. In the same city block, one cafe buzzed with screens and anxiety-driven chatter, while across the street, another hosted volunteers who came to practice mindful listening with refugees. Both groups occupied the same coordinates. Both had consequences. Thomas's grandson kept being the quiet fulcrum of his transformation. The boy's carefree curiosity remained a reminder of an unscored life. Once, on a hot afternoon, they planted a sapling in the community garden. The boy put his small hands in the dirt with unblunted joy. Thomas knelt beside him, felt earth under his nails, and for a moment, the being's language about nature as a tuning device felt bone-deep true.
He began, increasingly, to choose small, generous acts for no audience. He found satisfaction in ways that were not quantifiable in investment returns. The way a neighbor's face softened when he carried groceries. The way a child's question could open a conversation about meaning. The way Linda returned an unexpected tenderness when he made space for her. Through these years, Thomas kept one rule. He would not use the being's terms to evade responsibility. When crises required advocacy, he advocated. When policy issues demanded action, he engaged. The being had not told him to retreat into private mysticism. It had described practices that changed how one navigated public life. He lobbied for a modest municipal program to fund neighborhood gardens and silent listening sessions in schools. He testified at a city council meeting with measured words about attention as a public good.
His suggestions were small: training for teachers in mindful listening, funding for community green spaces, pilot programs for parent-child presence workshops. Some council members rolled their eyes. Others listened. The meetings were not fireworks. They were slow work that resembled the being's insistence on accumulation. There were darker moments as well. A local business exploited the language of frequency to sell fortune-telling services promising guaranteed ascension. Thomas felt rage at the manipulation, but also knew rage could calcify into the very density the being warned about. He decided instead to create educational materials, a short guide that explained the 7 practices plainly, with cautionary notes about mental health and step-by-step exercises anyone could try. He worked with the academic to frame it in accessible language and to include a clear disclaimer. Practices can help, but they are not a substitute for clinical care. The guide avoided metaphysical certainties and focused on practical steps. They published it as a free PDF pinned in an online forum for people curious about the practices. The being's timeline culminated in a quiet crescendo. The years between 2025 and 2033 continued to reveal both the sharpened contrast and the messy in-between spaces where people lived on a spectrum of attention. Some communities, through deliberate practice and policy change, experienced less transactional harm. Others, entrenched in extraction economies and information architectures designed to amplify fear, found darker densities settling into everyday life. The being's description of repeated cycles of difficulty for those who remain unexamined did not map cleanly onto everyone. There were many exceptions, and Thomas saw how resilience, support networks, and community resources could alter trajectories. The being had framed tendencies, not laws. By 2030, Thomas's life was recognizable to his earlier self in shape, but not in substance. He still showed up to board meetings for organizations he had once led, but his priorities had shifted. He asked questions in those meetings that would have seemed odd a decade before. How does this serve presence? Who benefits from attention extraction here? Colleagues who had known him as a strategist found the changes slow but noticeable. Some admired it, others found it inconvenient. He lost some old opportunities because he would not trade ethics for profit. He also gained small, steady joys. Family life softened in ways that felt deeply human. He and Linda created a ritual. Every Sunday evening, they prepared a simple meal together without screens and took turns describing 3 small things they were grateful for that week. It was not a cure-all. They still argued. Linda still carried worries about money and health. But the ritual created a seam of intentionality that allowed them to repair more quickly. His grandson grew, his gap-toothed grin widened. One night near his 12th birthday, the boy hugged Thomas and said, out of the blue, "Grandpa, I like how you stop and listen now." There are sentences in life that sound like verdicts. This one felt like confirmation. Thomas's community projects measured small markers. Fewer calls to neighborhood mediation services, more volunteers for the community garden, a local school piloting a listening curriculum that reduced incidents of bullying. These were not cosmic signposts. They were local effects from ordinary people practicing attention.
He took no metaphysical claims in them. He took them as fuel, data that small acts could cascade. Still, the world retained its capacity for sudden shocks. A global event, a cascade in supply chains triggered by an unexpected political crisis in a distant region, created scarcity in certain goods and stoked fear in many communities. News feeds amplified anxiety, and some people reacted by seeking certainty in authoritarian narratives that promised decisive answers. Thomas watched these reactions with sorrow. He redoubled his group's commitment to practical support, food-sharing initiatives, listening booths for those overwhelmed by fear, partnerships with mental health clinics to ensure people in crisis received immediate professional help. The being's counsel about clinical care echoed in each of these responses. Spiritual practice without structures of support, he had learned, could easily be hollow. In 2031, a weather event, severe and erratic, battered parts of the region, and the community rallied in the shape of the practices they had been nurturing. Neighbors who knew one another from the garden helped vulnerable residents evacuate. Volunteers brought hot meals to those without power. People who had learned mindful listening sat with survivors, grounding them until professional crisis counselors arrived. Those moments did not prove the being's cosmology. They did, however, prove the value of ordinary practices when systems frayed. Thomas felt a complicated gratitude for the being's instructions that had encouraged practice and for human networks that had chosen to act. As the supposed completion date in 2033 approached, public discourse oscillated between doomsaying and mundane governance. The being's narrative that a greater delineation would be perceptible after that year took many forms in popular imagination. Some groups constructed dualist frameworks that read the timeline as a spiritual litmus test. Others dismissed the story as a curiosity. Thomas remained careful. He recognized that apocalyptic language could be seductive and dangerous. He kept returning to the being's practical ethics, attention as a practice that reduces harm and increases presence. He discouraged dualistic thinking that turned people into in and out categories. He insisted that the being had not offered a salvation chart, but a set of everyday tools. When 2033 arrived, nothing dramatic happened on a single night. There was no cinematic split of the planet into distinct visible realms. What did intensify, in some places, was the experience of contrast Thomas had been shown. Neighborhoods where people had cultivated presence felt more resilient. Neighborhoods where attention was harvested by extractive systems experienced heightened strain. In some regions, institutions that had short-term gain as their compass responded by tightening surveillance and centralizing control, which further alienated communities from local agency. Those outcomes were not inevitable. They were contingent on social choices. The being's message about compounding small acts felt, by then, less like mystical prophecy and more like a lesson in emergent systems. Small differences in individual behavior can scale, for better or worse, through networks. Thomas kept practicing. He had failed and recovered more times than he could count. He had moments of deep sorrow, a friend who fell back into patterns of addiction, a heated public debate that left him shaken. Each time he returned to the basics: 5 minutes of gratitude, a pause before speaking, a walk in nature, an anonymous act of service, witnessing his feelings without judgment, a practice of self-forgiveness, and a purposeful action chosen for the common good. These were not guarantees. They were choices that increased the probability of a life shaped less by reaction and more by responsibility. In the quiet of one late summer evening, Thomas walked the garden path with Linda and their grandson. The boy had become a quick-handed teen who still liked to dig in the dirt. Linda slipped her hand into his, and Thomas noticed the gesture in a way he might once have glossed over. He felt for a moment unembarrassed joy. A neighbor across the fence waved, and Thomas waved back, not because he had an ego to feed, but because he was content to be present in a small net of relationships. That night, after tucking the boy into bed, Thomas sat with a cup of tea and a notebook. He had kept a journal since the visitation, a record that served less as proof than as a map of his interior. He wrote a short paragraph to himself. This was not about escaping reality, but deepening it. The being's visit was a teacher, not a savior. The practices are small and cumulative. The window was a call to urgent compassion, not panic. He closed the notebook and felt a bittersweet peace. The planet had not split into two visible spheres. What had happened was more complicated and more human. Realities had nodded in ways that made life both more perilous in some quarters and more open in others. The being's shocking revelation, that attention chooses destiny, and that a historical window existed to alter course, had had its effect not as an enforced binary, but as an invitation to care. Thomas did not expect everyone to accept the invitation. He did not think the world would become unanimous.
He did think, decisively, that the invitation was real and actionable. Before he went to sleep, he recorded a short message in his phone, not for the world, but for himself. A reminder of the 7 practices and the being's voice that insisted on humility, clinical care for serious suffering, and the ethic that presence is a currency to be spent on others. He did not want to become dogmatic. He wanted to remain capable of wonder and scrutiny in equal measure. He trusted that a life built on repeated small choices would, in aggregate, shift the way he experienced the world and, perhaps, how others did too. Years later, when he would look back on that backyard night and the slow arc that followed, he would remember something he had not understood at first. That the being's shock of revelation was, paradoxically, a quiet awakening to ordinary responsibility. The creature's blunt sentence, that attention chooses destiny, had been less about cosmic drama and more about the moral work of everyday life. If you are listening to Thomas's story now, you face a similar invitation. The dates the being shared were meant to provoke action, not panic. The pathway is not a set of guarantees. It is a set of practices that increase certain outcomes: presence, resilient relationships, less reactivity, and the capacity to build communal supports that can withstand shocks. Start small. 5 minutes of gratitude tomorrow morning. Pause before you speak when a loved one triggers you. Step outside to touch a living thing. Offer quiet, anonymous service. Forgive yourself when you fail and choose again. If this story resonates, there are resources. The short guide Thomas helped write, a modest ebook that lays out the practices and offers exercises you can try immediately. It's linked in the pinned comment for anyone who wants a practical path and prefers a low-hype, ethics-first approach. If your suffering is deep or persistent, seek professional help. Spiritual language is not a substitute for clinical care. Thomas's night in the desert did not split the planet with fireworks. What it did was give a man a new way to inhabit his life and a calendar that made his small choices feel urgent. The being's revelation was shocking not because it promised cosmic salvation, but because it asked something quite ordinary and hard. Would people retrain themselves to notice, to pause, and to act with the heart as a guide? The answer to that question is still being written in living rooms and gardens, in council chambers and classrooms, in quiet exchanges that do not make headlines. This was Thomas's night. The choice is yours.